If the fire refuses to rise, it means the one it needs has been cast aside. The first whisper moved through the grand hall before anyone noticed the flames were wrong, before the nobles stiffened in their seats or the guards tightened their grip on polished spears, before the Alpha King himself lifted his gaze toward the sacred altar where the ceremonial fire should have burned bright and steady, but instead flickered weakly like it was struggling to breathe, as if something essential had been removed from the room. And outside those towering stone doors, Elena Whitmore stood frozen at the bottom of the marble steps, the cold night air pressing against her skin as the echo of laughter still rang behind her, sharp and dismissive, a sound she had learned to endure but never accept. Her fingers curled slightly, as if they still remembered the warmth of the hall she had just been forced out of, her heart beating not with panic, but with a quiet, stubborn rhythm that refused to break even now. Even as the guard's words replayed in her mind, "You don't belong here," spoken not with anger but with certainty, as if it were a fact written into the bones of the world, and maybe it was, at least to them. To the wolves inside that hall who wore power like a second skin, who believed strength was measured in dominance and silence in obedience. And Elena had neither, at least not in the way they understood. She was an Omega, a quiet presence in a world that celebrated loud power. A girl who had learned early that kindness was often mistaken for weakness and patience for invisibility. But she had come anyway, because something inside her had told her this night mattered, not for status or recognition, but for something deeper she couldn't name, a pull that had drawn her toward the ceremony like gravity. And yet here she was, pushed back into the shadows before she could even cross the threshold, her worn shoes scraping lightly against the stone as she steadied herself, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold as she glanced once more at the sealed doors, hearing the faint rise of voices within, something shifting, something unsettled, though she couldn't see it. Inside the hall, the sacred fire dipped lower, the golden flames sputtering unevenly, drawing murmurs from the crowd as elders exchanged uneasy glances. The ritual had never faltered before, not in living memory, and yet tonight something was wrong, deeply wrong. The scent in the air was off, incomplete, as if a missing note in a song had thrown the entire melody into chaos. And at the center of it all, Alpha King Kale Draven stood still, his presence commanding even in silence, his silver eyes fixed on the wavering fire as a faint crease formed between his brows, not confusion, not yet, but awareness, the kind that came just before a storm, his wolf stirring beneath the surface, restless, searching, sensing something absent, something vital. While outside, Elena turned away, her shoulders straight despite the weight pressing against her chest. She didn't run, didn't look back again. She simply stepped down from the last of the stone steps and into the darker path leading away from the hall. Her pace steady, her thoughts quiet but heavy, because deep down she knew this wasn't just rejection. It felt like being removed from something that had needed her, even if no one else saw it. The forest beyond the ceremonial grounds welcomed her with familiar shadows, the scent of pine and damp earth grounding her as she walked further from the noise, her hand brushing lightly against the bark of a tree as if to remind herself she was still here, still real, still breathing. And then she heard it, a soft sound, barely there, like a breath caught between pain and silence. Elena stopped instantly, her head tilting as her senses sharpened, the world narrowing to that single fragile sound. She followed it without hesitation, stepping carefully over roots and fallen leaves until she reached a small clearing where the moonlight spilled across the ground in a pale silver glow. And there, just beyond the edge of the light, lay a figure, barely visible, motionless but not lifeless. Elena's breath caught as she moved closer, her instincts pulling her forward stronger than fear ever could. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering for a moment before gently pressing against his chest, warmth spreading through her palms almost instantly, unfamiliar yet undeniable, like something awakening inside her that had been waiting far longer than she had realized. And as she leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, "You're not alone." The man's eyes opened, sharp, silver, and filled with something ancient that made the air itself seem to shift. And miles away, inside the grand hall, Kale Draven inhaled sharply, his entire body going still, as his wolf surged forward with sudden, undeniable force, a single realization striking him with the clarity of lightning. Not seen, not heard, but felt, and his voice cut through the chaos. Low and absolute. She's missing. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt wrong, like the air itself had paused to listen, and every wolf in the hall felt it. That sharp, invisible shift that no one could explain but no one could ignore. Because when an alpha king spoke like that, it was not a question, it was instinct, and instinct did not lie. Cale Draven stood unmoving at the center of the chamber, his eyes no longer on the dying flames, but somewhere beyond the stone walls, beyond the gathered nobles and the heavy scent of ritual incense. His focus locked onto something he could not see but could feel slipping further away with every passing second. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, one of them stepping forward cautiously, his voice low and controlled. "Your Majesty, the ceremony must proceed." But Cale did not respond, not immediately, because something deeper than protocol had taken hold of him, something that pulled at his chest in a way that felt unfamiliar and undeniable, his wolf restless. Beneath his skin, pacing, searching, reacting to an absence that made no sense, because he had not noticed her before, had not marked her presence in the hall or acknowledged her existence among the many who gathered, and yet now, the absence of that unnoticed presence felt like a fracture in the world itself, like a missing piece that everything else had depended on without realizing it. His hand flexed slightly at his side as the sacred fire flickered again, weaker now, the golden glow, dimming to a fragile pulse that sent murmurs rippling through the crowd, fear beginning to thread through the edges of control, because rituals did not fail, not here, not under his rule, and yet they were failing now, unmistakably, and no one could understand why, no one except him, though even he did not understand how he knew, only that he did, and it was enough to make him turn sharply toward the massive doors of the hall, his voice cutting through the rising tension with quiet authority. "Open them." The command was immediate, absolute, and the guards hesitated only for a fraction of a second before obeying, the heavy doors creaking open to reveal the cold night beyond, and the moment the outside air rushed in, Cale inhaled deeply, his senses sharpening as he searched for something specific, something faint and already fading, a scent that had brushed against his awareness earlier without meaning, but now carried a weight he could not ignore. And it was there, just barely, lingering like the memory of warmth, delicate and steady, not dominant or overwhelming but present in a way that felt grounding. And it was moving away. Every instinct in him reacted at once, his wolf rising with a force that startled even him, not with aggression but with urgency, with a need that felt dangerously close to desperation. And that was when the realization struck fully, not as a thought, but as a certainty that settled deep into his bones. She had been there, and now she was not, and everything that should have been whole was unraveling without her. Back in the forest, Elena did not know any of this. She only knew the man before her was not ordinary, not because of the way he looked, but because of the way the air seemed to shift around him, as if the world itself was paying attention, her hands still resting against his chest, as that strange warmth continued to flow through her, steady and calm despite the tension building in her own heartbeat. His gaze remained fixed on her, sharp and searching, but not threatening. There was something else there, something quieter but far more intense, recognition. Though she could not understand how or why, she swallowed softly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. Curling through her thoughts, "You were hurt," she said simply, because that was what mattered to her, not who he was or why he was there, only that he had needed help, and she had given it. The man's lips parted slightly as if he was about to speak, but no words came at first. Instead, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like he was trying to reconcile something that did not fit. His hand moved slowly, not toward her, but toward where her touch rested, stopping just short as if he was testing whether she was real or something imagined. The warmth between them pulsed once, stronger this time, and Elena felt her breath catch as a strange certainty settled over her. Not fear, not confusion, but something deeper, something that felt like standing on the edge of a truth she had never been allowed to see before. And far behind her, though she could not hear it, the distant echo of chaos began to rise. the ceremony unraveling further as the sacred fire dimmed to nearly nothing. The elders now openly alarmed, their voices overlapping in urgent attempts to regain control. But nothing they did worked, because the ritual was not broken, it was incomplete, and the missing piece was walking further into the forest with every step she took. Kale did not wait any longer. The moment he confirmed the direction of that fading scent, he moved. Not with haste that showed panic, but with purpose that allowed no interruption. The crowd parted instinctively as he passed, no one daring to question him now. Not when the air itself seemed to bend around his intent, his cloak shifting behind him as he crossed the threshold of the hall and into the night. The cold did not slow him. The darkness did not obscure his path, because he was not searching blindly. He was following something precise, something that called to him in a way nothing ever had before, and with each step, that pull grew stronger, more defined, guiding him toward the one presence his instincts refused to lose, back. In the clearing, Elena finally withdrew her hands slightly. Though the warmth did not fully fade, it lingered between them like a quiet connection neither of them understood. She studied him for a moment. Longer, then offered a small, almost uncertain smile, the kind that carried more sincerity than confidence. "You should not stay out here alone," she said, glancing briefly at the shadows beyond the clearing, not with fear, but with awareness, because the world beyond the pack was not always kind, and she knew that better than most. The man's gaze softened just slightly at her words, though the intensity remained, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying a weight that made the air seem to still around it. "Neither should you." Elena blinked, caught off guard not by the words but by the way they felt, like they held meaning beyond the moment, like they were part of something larger neither of them had yet seen, and somewhere between them, unseen but undeniable, the first thread of something irreversible began to form, fragile but unbreakable, stretching quietly between two lives that had just begun to change in ways neither of them could stop, and far behind them, the Hall of Wolves stood on the edge of something it had never faced before, a ceremony that could not complete itself, a king who had walked away from tradition without hesitation, and a truth that was about to be revealed whether anyone was ready for it or not. "If you walk away now, everything behind you will fall apart, and you will never know why." The words came to her not from his voice but from the strange, quiet pulse settling deeper in her chest, and Elena Whitmore paused, her breath catching slightly as she turned her head just enough to look back at the man she had just helped, his silver eyes still fixed on her with an intensity that made the night feel smaller around them, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting, watching. And for a moment she did not move, not because she was afraid, but because something inside her was shifting, something that had been quiet her entire life now rising with a steady, undeniable presence, like a voice she had never been allowed to hear before, and it did not tell her to run, it did not tell her to hide, it told her to stay. But staying had never been safe for someone like her, not in a world that had already decided her place before she could even speak. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides as she forced herself to take a step back, putting a small but deliberate distance between them, her voice calm but carrying a quiet resolve. "You will be fine now," she said, because that was what she had always done, helped and then stepped away, never expecting anything in return, never waiting to be seen. But the man did not look relieved, did not look dismissed. Instead, something in his expression tightened, not in anger but in resistance, like he was refusing to let something important slip away without understanding it first. His gaze dropped briefly to where her hands had been, then lifted again, sharper now, more focused. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low but steady. And Elena hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because she had never had to explain it before. Her ability had always been small, quiet, dismissed as nothing more than a gentle touch, something useful, but insignificant. And yet what had just happened had not felt small. It had felt like something had answered her, something deeper than instinct. And she shook her head slightly, her brows drawing together in uncertainty. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. And for a brief moment, silence stretched between them again. But this time it felt different, heavier, charged with something unspoken, something neither of them could ignore anymore. And far beyond the trees, the night carried a Distant echo of urgency, footsteps moving fast over stone, a presence cutting through the darkness with purpose. Though Elena could not hear it, could not feel it yet, the man in front of her did, his head turning slightly, his attention shifting not away from her but outward, as if he was listening to something approaching, something inevitable. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, the weight in the air around him deepening. And Elena felt it then, not fear, but awareness, like standing too close to something powerful without fully understanding it. Her heart picked up slightly, not from panic but from recognition, because whatever he was, whatever he represented, it was not ordinary, and she had stepped into something far larger than a simple act of kindness. She took another step back, her voice softer now but firm. "You should go," she said, because something told her staying here would change everything, and not in a way she could control. But he did not move. Instead, his eyes returned fully to her, and this time there was no hesitation in them, only clarity. "No," he said quietly, and that single word settled between them with more weight than anything else spoken that night. Elena blinked, caught off guard, not by defiance but by certainty, because it was the kind of certainty she had never seen directed at her before, not from anyone. And before she could respond, the forest shifted, a subtle but undeniable change, the air growing sharper, the silence tightening, and then footsteps, measured and deliberate, approaching through the trees. Elena turned instinctively, her body reacting before her mind could catch up, and when she saw him, her breath caught completely. Not because she recognized his face, but because she recognized his presence, the way the world seemed to bend slightly around him, the way the air carried his authority even before he spoke. Alpha King Kale Draven stepped into the clearing, his gaze already locked onto her, not scanning, not searching, but fixed, as if he had known exactly where to look the moment he arrived. And for a heartbeat, everything stilled, the forest, the wind, even her thoughts, because the weight of that gaze was unlike anything she had ever felt before, not cruel, not dismissive, but intense, focused, and filled with something she could not name, something that made her chest tighten and her pulse quicken. And behind her, the man she had helped did not move, did not react. And yet something about his stillness now felt different, less like a stranger and more like a shadow of something larger, something connected. Elena swallowed softly, her instincts telling her to lower her gaze, to step back, to make herself smaller the way she always had in the presence of power. But her body did not obey. Instead, she stood where she was, caught between two forces she did not understand, one she had just helped, and one who now stood before her as the embodiment of everything she had been told she did not belong to. Kale's voice broke the silence, low and steady, but carrying an edge that made every word feel deliberate. "You left," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement that held more meaning than it should have. Elena blinked again, confusion flickering across her face, because she did not understand why that mattered, why he was here, why his attention was on her at all. Her voice came out softer than she intended, but still steady. "I was told to," she replied, and for a moment, something shifted in Kale's expression, subtle but undeniable, like a piece of information falling into place. And then his gaze flicked briefly past her, to the man still standing behind her, and everything changed, not outwardly, not in a way that would alarm or startle, but in a way that deepened the tension in the air, like a second realization layering over the first, something more complex, more dangerous in its implications. And when his eyes returned to Elena, they held something new, something that made her breath catch without understanding why. "And yet," he said quietly, "everything fell apart the moment you did." And the words hung there, impossible and undeniable, settling into her chest with a weight that made no sense. Because how could someone like her matter that much? How could her absence cause anything to change? And yet the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. And for the first time that night, Elena Whitmore felt the fragile beginning of something she had never allowed herself before. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility that everything she had been told about her place in the world might not be true. And that possibility was far more terrifying than rejection had ever been. "Do you understand what you are saying?" Elena's voice was barely above a whisper, but it did not tremble. It held something fragile yet firm, like a thread pulled tight between disbelief and something dangerously close to truth. And Cale Draven did not look away from her, did not soften the weight of his gaze or step back from what he had just declared, because he knew exactly what he was saying. Even if he did not yet understand how it was possible, the air between them felt different now, no longer just tense but charged with something deeper, something that neither of them could ignore, the kind of presence that reshaped everything around it without asking permission. Elena's heart beat unevenly in her chest as she searched his expression for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was a misunderstanding she could safely dismiss. But there was none, only certainty, and that certainty unsettled her more than rejection ever had. Because rejection, she understood, it was familiar, predictable, safe in its cruelty. But this was something else entirely, something that threatened to rewrite everything she thought she knew about herself, about her place in the world, and she did not know how to stand inside that without losing her balance. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides as she forced herself to speak again. "I am just an Omega," she said, not as a complaint but as a fact, a label that had been placed on her so many times it had become part of her identity, whether she wanted it or not. And for a moment, silence answered her, not empty, but full, as if the forest itself rejected the simplicity of that statement. Cale's gaze sharpened slightly, not in anger but in focus, like he was seeing past the words to something deeper, something she could not yet see herself. "No," he said quietly, and that single word carried more weight than anything else spoken that night. Elena's breath caught, not because of the contradiction, but because of the way he said it, like he was not denying her reality, but redefining it. And before she could respond, the man behind her moved, just slightly, but enough to draw Cale's attention fully. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second, and something unspoken passed between them, something Elena could not understand but could feel, like standing between two currents of power that did not clash but recognized each other. And for the first time, she realized she was not just in the presence of something powerful, she was in the center of it. Cale's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders straightening, his presence deepening, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer just directed at her, but carried outward, as if addressing something larger than the moment itself. "You were at the ceremony," he said, and Elena nodded slowly, confusion still clouding her thoughts. "Yes," she answered, and Cale's gaze held hers, unwavering. "And when you left, the fire failed." The words settled into the space between them, heavy and undeniable. Elena blinked, her mind struggling to connect the two. Her voice came softer now, more uncertain than before. "That is not possible," she said, because it was not, because nothing she had ever been told allowed for that kind of connection. And yet the certainty in his voice made it impossible to dismiss completely. Cale stepped closer, not threatening, not forceful, but deliberate, closing the distance just enough to make the air between them feel smaller, more intimate, though nothing about it was inappropriate. It was simply focused, intense, undeniable. "It is already happening," he said, and as if his words carried weight beyond sound, something shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, a faint pulse in the air, like a distant echo of the ceremony reaching toward them. Elena felt it brush against her senses, light but persistent, and her breath caught as that warmth inside her stirred again, responding to something she could not see, something calling, and she instinctively took a small step back, her hand pressing lightly against her chest as if to steady the unfamiliar sensation. "I do not understand," she admitted, and for the first time, there was a hint of something softer in Cale's expression, not doubt, not weakness, but recognition, because neither did he, not fully, but he understood enough to know that this was not coincidence, that this was something deeper, something rooted in the very structure of their world, something that had been hidden or ignored until now, and he was not going to let it slip away again. His voice lowered slightly, though the authority in it remained. "You do not need to understand it yet," he said. "You only need to stay." And that word settled into her with a weight that made her chest tighten. Stay, not leave, not disappear, not step back into the shadows where she had always been expected to remain, but stay, present, seen, necessary. And the idea of that was both terrifying and impossible to ignore. Elena hesitated, her instincts pulling her in two directions at once. One toward safety, toward the familiar pattern of stepping away before she could be pushed again, and the other toward something unknown but undeniable, something that felt like standing at the edge of a life she had never been allowed to imagine. Her gaze dropped briefly, her thoughts racing as she tried to find something solid to hold on to, something that made sense. But nothing did, not the ceremony failing, not the king standing before her, as if she mattered, not the strange connection she felt to the man behind her, or the way the air itself seemed to shift in her presence. And yet all of it was real, undeniable in its own way. She lifted her gaze again, meeting Cale's eyes with a quiet strength that had always been there, even when no one chose to see it. "If I stay," she said slowly, "everything changes." And it was not a question, it was a realization, and Cale did not hesitate, did not soften the truth or pretend otherwise. "Yes," he answered, and that single word carried the weight of everything that had already begun to shift, everything that would continue to change whether they were ready for it or not. And for a moment, the world held still around them, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was, and Elena Whitmore stood at the center of it, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, but seen in a way that could not be undone. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and uncertainty, something quiet and powerful began to rise, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, like a flame that had finally found the air it needed to burn. "Then do not run from it this time." The thought pressed against her mind before she could even decide if she was afraid, and Elena Whitmore felt it settle deep in her chest like a quiet challenge, not forced, not overwhelming, but impossible to ignore. She stood there between them, between the life she had always known and something entirely unknown, her breath slow but uneven as she tried to steady herself against the shift happening not around her, but within her. Because this was not just about a ceremony or a mistake, or even the Alpha King standing in front of her. This was about her, about something in her that had never been acknowledged and was now being pulled into the light whether she was ready or not. Her gaze lifted again to meet Cale Draven's, and for the first time she did not feel smaller under it. She felt seen, and that difference alone made her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something sharper, something closer to awakening. Cale did not move, did not rush her decision or break the fragile moment forming between them, but his presence did not waver. It held steady, grounded, like he already understood the weight of what he was asking and was willing to stand inside it with her. And behind her, the man she had helped remained silent, but not distant. His stillness now felt intentional, like he was allowing something to unfold rather than interrupting it, and that only deepened the strange tension in the air. Elena drew a slow breath, her hand still resting lightly against her chest where that warmth had begun to grow stronger, no longer just a faint flicker, but something steady, something alive, and she realized with a quiet clarity that whatever this was, it had been there before tonight, hidden beneath layers of dismissal and silence, waiting, and now it had been triggered, awakened by something she could not undo. Her voice came softer now, but clearer than before. "If I stay," she said again, as if testing the weight of the words, "then I am not who they said I was." And that truth lingered in the space between them, fragile but undeniable. Cale's gaze did not shift, did not soften into reassurance or harden into command. It simply remained, steady and certain. "You never were," he answered, and the simplicity of that response struck deeper than anything else had, because it did not try to convince her, it did not argue or explain, it simply stated something as fact, something she had never been allowed to consider before. And for a moment, Elena felt the ground beneath her shift in a way that was not physical, but fundamental, like the foundation of her identity had been quietly moved, and she had to decide whether to follow it or cling to what had always been expected of her. The forest around them seemed to grow quieter, the distant sounds fading as if the world itself was narrowing to this single moment, this single choice. And Elena realized she had spent her entire life reacting, adjusting, shrinking to fit what others believed she was. But this was the first time she had been given the chance to choose something different, not because someone forced her to, but because something inside her was rising to meet it. Her fingers relaxed slightly at her sides, the tension in her shoulders easing not because the situation was less intense, But because she was no longer trying to resist it, she took a small step forward, not toward safety, not toward familiarity, but toward him, toward the unknown. And that single step felt heavier than anything she had ever done, because it carried with it the weight of everything she was leaving behind. The expectations, the dismissal, the quiet acceptance of being overlooked. And as her foot settled against the ground, something shifted again, not just within her, but outward, the air itself responding in a subtle but unmistakable way. A faint pulse that moved through the clearing like a ripple, and Cale felt it immediately, his breath catching slightly as his wolf surged forward with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not coincidence. This was connection, something ancient and precise, something that had been waiting for this exact moment to align. His gaze deepened, not with possession, not with dominance, but with recognition, the kind that acknowledged something rare and irreplaceable. Elena felt it too, though she could not name it, only that it made her chest tighten and her heartbeat steady at the same time. Like her body had found a rhythm it had always been meant to follow. And for the first time, she did not feel out of place inside it. Behind her, the man she had helped finally shifted again, stepping slightly to the side, not leaving, but no longer directly behind her. And Elena realized then that he had never truly been separate from this moment, that his presence had been part of it from the beginning, a catalyst, a trigger, something that had brought her to this exact point. And that realization sent a quiet wave of understanding through her, though she still did not know who he was or why he mattered, only that he did. Cale's voice broke the silence again, lower now, but no less steady. The ceremony is still waiting, he said, not as a reminder of obligation, but as a statement of consequence, because what had started in that hall had not ended. It had paused, incomplete, and the longer it remained that way, the more unstable everything would become. Elena's gaze flickered briefly toward the direction of the hall, though she could not see it from here, only feel the faint echo of something unresolved, something calling, and she understood then that this was not just about her choice. It was about what that choice would affect, not just her life, but everything connected to it. And that realization did not push her back. It steadied her further. Her voice came quiet but certain. "Then we should not keep it waiting," she said. And the moment the words left her, something in the air settled, not completely, but enough to confirm what Cale had already known, that she was not stepping away again, that she had chosen to stay, and that choice, simple as it seemed, carried with it the beginning of something far greater than either of them had yet fully understood. Cale inclined his head slightly, not in command, but in acknowledgement, and when he turned, it was not to lead her as someone beneath him, but to walk with her toward what was coming. And Elena followed, not behind, not hidden, but beside him, each step forward pulling her further from the life she had known and deeper into one that had already begun to change the moment she was told she did not belong. Every step you take now will be seen. The quiet warning lingered in Elena Whitmore's mind as the trees began to thin and the distant glow of torchlight returned, flickering against the night sky like a reminder of the world she had just left behind. Only now it did not feel the same. Nothing did. Not the air, not the silence, not even the sound of her own footsteps beside Cale Draven. Because she was not walking back as the same girl who had been turned away, she could feel that much with a clarity that both steadied and unsettled her, her senses sharper, her awareness deeper, as if something within her had awakened and refused to go quiet again. The path beneath her feet seemed more solid, each step more intentional. And though she did not look at Cale directly, she was acutely aware of him, of the way his presence did not overshadow her, but aligned with her, steady and unwavering, like he had already accepted something she was still learning to understand. And behind them, though she could not see him anymore, she felt the absence of the man she had helped, not as loss, but as a completed moment, like his purpose had been fulfilled the instant she chose to turn back, and that realization settled quietly in her chest, unanswered but undeniable, as the massive doors of the hall came into view once more, still open, still waiting, the light spilling outward in a way that felt less welcoming and more uncertain, as if the place itself was holding its breath, unsure of what would happen next. And as they approached, the murmurs inside grew louder, no longer controlled or composed, but edged with confusion, with unease, with something dangerously close to fear, because nothing about this night was following the rules they had trusted for generations, and Elena felt it before she even stepped inside, the tension thick in the air, pressing against her skin, brushing against that strange warmth within her that now pulsed stronger with every step, responding to something just beyond the threshold. And when she crossed it, everything changed, not outwardly at first. The hall still stood the same. The same towering columns, the same gathered wolves, the same altar at the center, but the atmosphere shifted instantly, like a missing piece had been returned to a structure that had begun to collapse. The murmurs faltered, the movement stilled, and one by one, eyes turned toward her, not dismissive this time, not mocking or indifferent, but searching, confused, drawn by something they could not explain. Elena felt it hit her all at once. The weight of attention she had never carried before. Her instinct was to step back, to lower her gaze, to disappear the way she always had. But she did not. Her feet held steady, her shoulders straight despite the pressure, because something inside her refused to shrink now. Not after everything that had shifted, not after the truth she had begun to feel. Cale stepped forward beside her, his presence cutting through the rising tension with quiet authority. And though he did not speak immediately, his mere presence commanded the room to still, the elders watching closely, the guards rigid, the nobles exchanging uneasy glances, because they could all feel it now, the subtle but undeniable change in the air, the way the energy of the hall responded to her presence, even if they did not understand why. And at the center of it all, the sacred fire flickered again, weak but no longer dying, as if it had sensed something it had been waiting for. Elena's breath caught softly as she looked toward it, her chest tightening as that warmth inside her responded instantly, stronger now, pulling her forward with a quiet insistence she could not ignore. Her steps slowed as she moved closer, not because she was afraid, but because she felt the weight of what was happening, the significance of it pressing against her in a way that made every movement feel deliberate. And the closer she got, the more the fire reacted, the flames rising slightly, gaining strength, not fully restored but no longer fading, and the shift was impossible to miss. A ripple moving through the gathered wolves as realization began to dawn, slow and uncertain but growing. Elena stopped just short of the altar, her gaze fixed on the fire, her hand lifting slightly without conscious thought, drawn by that same warmth that now felt like a connection rather than a mystery. And for a moment, everything held still, the entire hall suspended in a silence so complete it felt like the world itself was waiting. And then, as her fingers moved just a fraction closer, the flames surged, not violently, not uncontrollably, but with a steady, undeniable strength, rising higher, brighter, filling the space with a warmth that had been missing. And the reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, the sound of disbelief breaking through the silence as the fire stabilized, no longer struggling, no longer incomplete, but whole. And Elena felt it then. Not just the warmth in her hands, but the connection itself, something flowing through her, not draining, not overwhelming, but aligning, like she had stepped into a place she had always been meant to stand. Her breath left her slowly as she lowered her hand, her heart steady now, no longer racing, no longer uncertain, because whatever this was, it was real, undeniable in a way that could not be dismissed or explained away. And when she lifted her gaze again, the way the room looked at her had changed completely. No longer dismissive, no longer indifferent, but stunned, searching, and something else, something that had not been there before, recognition, not fully formed, not yet accepted, but present. And at her side, Cale's voice broke the silence, low and absolute, carrying across the hall with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "The ceremony continues," he said, and the weight of those words settled into every corner of the room, not just as a command, but as a declaration. Because what had been uncertain was no longer in question, what had been dismissed could no longer be ignored. And Elena Whitmore, the Omega who had been turned away, now stood at the center of something none of them could control, something that had already begun to reshape everything they thought they understood. What happens when the one they dismissed becomes the center of everything? The question did not need to be spoken aloud because every wolf in that hall was already asking it in their own way. their eyes fixed on Elena Whitmore as she stood before the altar, the fire now steady and alive behind her, no longer flickering in uncertainty, but burning with a quiet, undeniable strength that filled the chamber with warmth and tension in equal measure. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. Something had changed and no one could pretend otherwise. Elena felt it pressing against her from every direction. The weight of attention, the confusion, the disbelief, and something else she had never felt directed toward her before, something that made her chest tighten in a way that was not entirely fear, respect, fragile and uncertain, but beginning to form. She drew a slow breath, grounding herself as best as she could, because even now, even standing here, part of her still expected to be told to step back, to move aside, to remember her place. But no one spoke, no one moved. And that silence was louder than any rejection she had ever faced. Cale Draven stepped forward beside her, his presence anchoring the moment without overshadowing it, his gaze sweeping briefly across the gathered wolves before returning to her. And when he spoke again, his voice carried not just authority, but finality. "The ritual resumes," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no challenge, because the evidence stood before them all. The fire, the shift, the undeniable connection they could all feel but could not explain. The elders exchanged looks, their uncertainty still present but no longer dominant, because what had just happened could not be ignored. It demanded acknowledgement whether they were ready or not. One of them stepped forward slowly, his voice measured but carrying a weight of reluctant acceptance. "Then she must stand within the circle," he said, and the words seemed to ripple through the hall, drawing sharper reactions from the crowd. Whispers rising, disbelief surfacing, because placing an Omega at the center of a ritual like this was not just unusual, it was unheard of, and yet no one openly opposed it. Not when the fire itself had already responded to her presence. Elena heard the words, felt their impact settle over her, and for a moment, her breath caught again, not from fear this time, but from the realization of what was being asked, what was being given, not a dismissal, not a rejection, but a place, a role, something she had never been allowed before. Her gaze flickered briefly to Cale, searching, not for permission, but for understanding, and he gave it without hesitation, a slight nod, steady and certain, and that was enough. Elena stepped forward, into the circle, into the center of something that had once excluded her entirely, and as her foot crossed the boundary, the air shifted again, more noticeably this time. A subtle hum that moved through the space like a current finding its path. The fire behind her responded instantly, the flames rising higher, brighter, casting a warm glow that reached every corner of the hall, and the reaction from the crowd was immediate, the whispers cutting off, replaced by a stunned silence that spoke louder than any words could. Elena felt the warmth wrap around her, not overwhelming, not consuming, but steady, supportive, like something recognizing her presence and aligning with it. Her hands remained at her sides, but she could feel the energy moving through her, not as something foreign, but as something that had always been there, now finally acknowledged. Cale stepped closer as well, taking his place opposite her, the distance between them intentional, precise, part of a structure that now felt complete rather than forced. His gaze did not leave hers, not even as the elders began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, carrying the ancient words of the ritual that had been interrupted, now resumed with a new, undeniable element at its center. Elena listened. Though she did not understand every word, she felt them, the cadence, the intention, the way they seemed to weave through the air and settle into the space between her and Cale, strengthening the connection that had already begun to form. Her breathing steadied, matching the rhythm unconsciously, her awareness narrowing not to the crowd, not to the pressure, but to the moment itself, to the presence before her, to the fire behind her, and to the quiet certainty growing within her that this was not a mistake, not an accident, but something that had always been meant to happen, even if no one had seen it coming. And then, as the chant reached a shift, a subtle change in tone that signaled the next step, the elder's voice rose slightly above the others, clear and deliberate. "The bond must be acknowledged," he said, and the words carried a weight that settled heavily over the hall, because this was the point where the ritual would define, would confirm, would reveal what had only been suggested so far. Elena felt her pulse quicken slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation, from the awareness that whatever happened next would not just change how others saw her, it would change everything. Kale took a single step closer, closing part of the distance between them, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a calm certainty that mirrored everything else he had done that night. And Elena did not step back, did not retreat, because she understood now that this was not something to avoid. It was something to face. Her gaze held his, steady despite the intensity building around them. And in that moment, the rest of the hall seemed to fade, not disappearing, but becoming less important than what was happening between them. The connection, the recognition, the undeniable alignment that had already begun and now stood on the edge of being fully revealed. The elder's voice came again, softer now, but no less powerful. Do you accept what stands before you? And though the question was directed at Kale, Elena felt it resonate within her as well, because acceptance was not one-sided, it was shared, and for a brief moment, everything held still, waiting, and then Kale spoke, his voice low but carrying through the entire hall with absolute clarity. I do. And the words settled into the space like a final piece falling into place. And in that instant, the fire surged again, brighter than before, filling the hall with a warmth that was no longer uncertain, no longer incomplete, but whole, and every wolf present felt it. The shift, the confirmation, the undeniable truth that the one they had overlooked was not only part of this, she was essential to it. And Elena Whitmore stood at the center of it all, no longer unseen, no longer dismissed, but recognized in a way that could not be undone. Then say it. The elder's voice carried through the hall, not loud, but impossible to ignore, as if the very air demanded completion, and Elena Whitmore felt the words settle around her like a tightening circle, not trapping her, but drawing her deeper into something that had already begun, her breath slow but deliberate as she stood within the ritual space, the fire behind her no longer uncertain, no longer fragile, but alive in a way that felt connected to her presence, responding to her without hesitation, without doubt, and that realization alone sent a quiet tremor through her thoughts. Because for the first time in her life, something powerful was not rejecting her, it was aligning with her, and that truth was both grounding and overwhelming in equal measure. Kale Draven stood across from her, closer now than before, his gaze unwavering, not questioning, not searching, but recognizing, and that recognition carried a weight that made the moment feel larger than anything she had ever experienced. The elders' voices resumed their low chant, the rhythm steady, guiding, building towards something that could no longer be delayed, and Elena felt it. In her chest, that same warmth, now stronger, more defined, moving in sync with the cadence of the ritual, like it had been waiting for this exact moment to fully emerge. Her hands remained still at her sides, but the energy within her was no longer quiet. It was present, undeniable, and it responded as the elder spoke again. The bond stands before you, unseen until now, denied until this moment. The words echoed through the hall, settling into every corner, and Elena felt them resonate within her, not as something new, but as something recognized, something that had always existed beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. Her gaze held Kale's, steady despite the intensity of everything around them, and for a brief moment, the noise of the crowd, the presence of the elders, even the fire itself faded into the background, leaving only the connection between them, quiet but unbreakable. The elder's voice continued, softer now, but carrying a deeper weight. It cannot be forced, it cannot be denied, it can only be accepted. And the words seemed to settle directly into Elena's chest, not as pressure, but as truth, and she realized then that this was not about proving something to the others, not about earning a place she had been denied. This was about choosing whether to stand inside something that had already chosen her. Her breath caught slightly, her thoughts shifting as she allowed herself to feel it fully, the connection, the warmth, the certainty that had been growing since the moment she stepped back into the hall. And for the first time, she did not question it. She did not push it away or try to make it smaller, so it would fit within the expectations she had always been given. She simply stood within it, allowing it to exist without apology, Kale took another step closer, the distance between them now minimal, but still deliberate, still part of the ritual's structure. His voice came low, steady, meant only for her, though it carried clearly in the silence. "You are not what they believed," he said, and the words did not feel like reassurance. They felt like confirmation, like something being stated that had always been true, whether anyone had seen it or not. Elena felt her chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of hearing something she had never allowed herself to believe. Her voice came quieter, but no less steady. "Then why was I never seen?" And the question was not bitter, not accusing. It was honest, vulnerable in a way she had never allowed herself before, because she was no longer hiding from what this meant. Kale's gaze did not waver, his answer immediate. "Because they were not looking for you." And the simplicity of it struck deeper than anything else, not because it excused what had happened, but because it reframed it entirely. She had not been invisible, she had been overlooked, and those were not the same thing. Elena inhaled slowly, the realization settling into her in a way that felt both heavy and freeing. And for a moment, she closed her eyes, not to retreat, but to center herself, to acknowledge what had been denied and what was now undeniable. And when she opened them again, there was something different in her gaze, something steadier, something that no longer asked for permission to exist. The elder's voice rose again, stronger now, carrying the final weight of the ritual. "Then, speak your acceptance." And the words settled over her like a final step she could not avoid. The hall silent, every eye fixed on her now, not dismissive, not mocking, but waiting, and Elena felt it. The weight of that expectation, the pressure of being seen, truly seen, for the first time. And for a brief moment, the old instinct flickered, the urge to step back, to let someone else take this place. But it faded just as quickly, because that place no longer existed for her. She was already here, already part of something that could not be undone. Her gaze lifted fully to meet Kale's, her voice steady, clear, carrying across the hall without hesitation. "I accept." And the moment the words left her, everything shifted, not violently, not suddenly, but with a deep, undeniable certainty. The fire surged once more, brighter than it had been all night, filling the hall with a warmth that was no longer searching, no longer incomplete, but whole, and the connection between them solidified, not as something forced, not as something claimed, but as something acknowledged, something that had always been there, now fully realized. And the reaction in the hall was immediate, a collective intake of breath, the sound of disbelief breaking into something else, something closer to understanding, because what they were witnessing was not a mistake, not an anomaly. It was truth, undeniable and irreversible. And Elena Whitmore, who had been turned away, now stood at the center of it, no longer as an outsider, but as an essential part of something none of them could ignore. And in that moment, she did not feel small. She did not feel uncertain. She felt steady, grounded in a way she had never experienced before, because for the first time, she was not standing in someone else's expectation. She was standing in her own truth, and that truth had changed everything. Once spoken, it cannot be undone. The elder's voice carried softly through the hall, but now it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like a truth that had already taken root, and Elena Whitmore felt it settle deep within her, not as something foreign, but as something that had finally found its place. The moment her words had left her lips, something irreversible had shifted, not just in the fire, not just in the ritual, but in the way the world itself responded to her. The air felt different, steadier, like a structure that had been unstable had suddenly aligned, and she could feel it in her breathing, in the way her heartbeat no longer raced but held a calm, grounded rhythm that felt unfamiliar and yet completely natural at the same time. Kale Draven remained before her, his gaze unwavering, but now, there was something new in it, something deeper than recognition, something closer to certainty, like a question that had been answered without needing to be asked again. And for a moment, neither of them moved, because movement felt unnecessary, the connection between them already established, already acknowledged in a way that could not be undone or ignored. Around them, the hall remained silent, but it was no longer the stunned silence of disbelief. It was something else, something heavier, more complex, because what had just occurred did not fit into the rules they understood. It did not follow the structure they had relied on for generations. And yet it had happened, undeniable, irreversible, and now they had to face it. The elders exchanged looks again, but this time their expressions had changed, no longer uncertain, no longer dismissive, but thoughtful, cautious, as if they were recalibrating everything they believed in real time. One of them stepped forward slowly, his voice measured but no longer resistant. "The bond has been acknowledged," he said, and the words carried a weight that settled into every corner of the hall, confirming what none of them could deny. Elena heard it, felt it, and though the words should have felt overwhelming, they did not. They felt steady, like something she had already accepted before anyone else had spoken it aloud. Her gaze lowered briefly, not in submission, but in reflection, as she allowed the moment to settle fully within her. To understand not just what had happened, but what it meant, because this was not just about being seen. This was about being essential, about being part of something that could not function without her. And that truth carried a responsibility she had never been given before. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself again, because she knew this was only the beginning, not the end. The elder continued, his voice steady. "Then the ritual must be completed." And at those words, a subtle tension returned to the air, not chaotic, not uncertain, but focused, because completion meant more than acknowledgement. It meant confirmation. It meant the final step that would define what this connection truly was. Elena felt her pulse shift slightly, not from fear, but from awareness, because she understood now that this moment would shape everything that came after. Kale took another step forward, closing the distance between them completely, no longer separated by space or uncertainty. His presence now directly before her, steady and grounded. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, meant for her, though it carried through the quiet of the hall. "You do not need to be anything else," he said, and the words settled into her with a weight that felt both simple and profound, because for the first time, she was not being asked to change, to prove, to become something she was not. She was being accepted exactly as she was, and that acceptance was more powerful than anything she had ever been offered. Elena's breath caught slightly, her gaze lifting to meet his fully, and for a moment, the world beyond them faded again, not disappearing, but becoming less important than the truth standing between them. Her voice came softer now, but no less certain. "Then I will not step away again." And the words felt like a promise, not just to him, but to herself. Kale's expression shifted slightly, not into a smile, but into something just as meaningful, a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of the weight behind her words, and for a moment, that was enough. But the ritual did not pause. The elders resumed their chant once more, the rhythm stronger now, more confident, no longer uncertain or searching, but guiding toward a conclusion that had already begun to form. Elena felt it in the air, in the way the energy around her responded, no longer pulling, no longer searching, but aligning, settling into something stable, something complete. And then, as the chant reached its final cadence, the elder's voice rose once more, clear and deliberate. "Then let it be witnessed." And the words echoed through the hall, carrying with them the final weight of what had been set into motion. The fire behind Elena surged once more, not higher, not brighter, but steadier, like a flame that had found its balance and would not falter again. And in that moment, every wolf present understood something they could not ignore. This was not a mistake. This was not an exception. This was a truth that had always existed, now revealed. And Elena Whitmore, the one they had dismissed, now stood at the center of it, not as someone who had changed, but as someone who had finally been seen. And as that realization settled into the hall, something else followed, quieter, but just as powerful. The understanding that everything they believed about strength, about worth, about who belonged and who did not, would have to change as well, because the world they thought they understood had just proven them wrong, and it had done so through the one person they had never thought to look at twice. Some truths do not arrive to be accepted. They arrive to be proven. The thought settled quietly over the hall as the final echo of the elder's words faded into stillness. And for a brief moment, everything held its place, the fire steady, the air aligned, the connection acknowledged, as if the world itself had paused to mark what had just been completed. But Elena Whitmore felt it before anyone else did. The subtle shift beneath the surface. The sense that this was not the end of something, but the beginning of something far more complicated. Her breath remained calm, her posture steady, but inside her awareness sharpened, because the silence that followed was not empty. It was expectant, and expectation in a room like this was never simple. Cale Draven did not step away from her, did not turn back toward the elders or the gathered wolves. He remained exactly where he was, his presence anchored beside hers as if he understood that what had just been confirmed would now be tested. Not by ritual, but by belief. And around them, the hall began to move again, not physically at first, but in the way tension shifted, in the way glances were exchanged, in the way unspoken questions began to take form in the space between those who had just witnessed something they did not yet know how to accept. One of the nobles near the front took a small step forward, not enough to challenge, but enough to be noticed. His voice controlled, but edged with something less certain than before. "This has never happened," he said. And though he did not raise his voice, it carried clearly, because everyone in the room was already thinking the same thing. Elena heard it, felt the weight behind it. But this time it did not press her down. It did not make her want to retreat. Instead, it clarified something within her, because he was right. This had never happened, and yet it had. Right here, undeniable. And that meant the rules they had relied on were not as absolute as they believed. Cale's gaze shifted briefly toward the speaker. Not with irritation, not with dismissal, but with a calm authority that did not need to assert itself loudly. "Then it has now," he replied, and the simplicity of that response cut through the uncertainty like a clean line, not arguing, not explaining, but establishing a new reality that could not be undone simply because it was unfamiliar. The noble did not respond immediately, his expression tightening slightly, not in defiance, but in recalculation. Because the foundation beneath his understanding had just shifted, and he was not alone. The entire hall was adjusting in real time, trying to reconcile what they had just seen with what they had always believed. Elena remained still, but her awareness expanded outward now, no longer focused only on Cale or the fire, but on the room itself, on the way the energy moved, on the way some wolves leaned forward slightly, curious, while others held back, uncertain. And she realized something important in that moment. This was not just about being accepted. It was about being challenged, because recognition did not erase doubt. It invited it. And how she stood now would determine what came next. Her fingers relaxed at her sides, the warmth within her steady, no longer rising or shifting, but present in a way that felt like a foundation rather than a reaction. She lifted her gaze slightly, not just to Cale, but to the room. Not in defiance, not in demand, but in quiet acknowledgement. She saw them now, all of them, not as a distant crowd, but as individuals reacting to something they could not control, and for the first time, she did not feel separate from them. She felt central to what they were, all trying to understand. The elder who had spoken before stepped forward again, his expression more composed now, though still thoughtful. "Then it must be recorded," he said, his voice carrying the weight of tradition adjusting to something new. "The bond must be recognized not just by witness, but by law." And the words settled heavily, because law meant permanence, meant that what had just occurred would not remain an anomaly. It would become part of the structure itself. Elena felt that shift immediately. The difference between being seen in a moment and being acknowledged in a system, and that carried a different kind of weight, one that extended beyond this night, beyond this hall, into every part of the world she had once been excluded from. Cale inclined his head slightly, not in submission, but in agreement. "It will be," he said. And again, there was no hesitation, no doubt. Because he was not asking for acceptance, he was establishing it. And that certainty did something unexpected within Elena. It did not overwhelm her. It steadied her further, because she realized she was not standing here alone, not carrying this alone. The connection between them was not symbolic. It was real, active, something that supported rather than confined. And that changed how she stood, how she breathed, how she held the space she now occupied. The murmurs in the hall began again, but they were different now, less chaotic, more focused, as if the room itself was beginning to reorganize around this new reality. And Elena felt it, not as pressure, but as alignment, like pieces shifting into place, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to begin forming a new structure. Her gaze returned to Kale briefly, and for a moment, nothing needed to be said, because the understanding between them had already been established, and then, slowly, she turned her attention forward again, no longer standing as someone waiting to be told where she belonged, but as someone who had already stepped into that place, and in doing so, had changed the shape of it entirely. The fire behind her burned steady, no longer reacting, no longer fluctuating, but present, constant, and in that constancy, Elena Whitmore understood something that went beyond the ritual, beyond the hall, beyond the expectations of anyone present. She had not been brought here to be accepted. She had been brought here to reveal something that had been overlooked, something that could not be ignored once seen. And now that it had been seen, nothing would return to the way it had been before. Recognition changes the moment, but acceptance changes the future. The quiet realization moved through Elena Whitmore as the hall slowly adjusted around her. The tension no longer sharp, but settling into something heavier, something that would not disappear simply because the ritual had been completed. She stood where she was, still within the circle, still beside Kale Draven. But now the stillness felt different. No longer suspended in uncertainty, but grounded in consequence. Because what had been revealed could not be undone, and now it had to be understood. Her breath remained steady, her posture unchanged, but her awareness expanded again, not just sensing the shift in the room, but feeling the way it began to ripple outward, beyond the walls of the hall, beyond the ceremony itself. Because this was not something that would remain contained. It would spread, it would be questioned, it would be challenged. And that knowledge did not frighten her the way it once might have. Instead, it clarified something deeper, something she had not fully realized until now. She was no longer reacting to the world around her. She was influencing it. And that change carried a responsibility she could not ignore. Kale remained beside her, his presence steady, not pressing, not overwhelming, but constant in a way that grounded everything else. His gaze moved across the room briefly, not searching, but observing, measuring the reactions, the shifts, the unspoken resistance that had not disappeared, only quieted. And then his attention returned to her, not because she needed reassurance, but because he understood that this moment was not finished, not truly. The elder who had spoken before stepped forward again, his expression now more composed, though still thoughtful. "The record will be made," he said, his voice carrying the formal weight of decision. "And the bond will be recognized across all territories." And the words settled into the hall with a different kind of impact, not immediate, not emotional, but structural, because recognition within this room was one thing, recognition beyond it was another entirely. Elena felt that difference clearly. The expansion of what had begun here, reaching outward into a world that had never made space for her before, and for a moment, she allowed herself to consider it, not fully, not all at once, but enough to understand that her life had already changed in ways she could not reverse. Her gaze lowered slightly, not in retreat, but in thought, because she knew this would not be simple, it would not be easy, and it would not be accepted without question. But for the first time, she did not feel like something being forced into a space that resisted her. She felt like something that space had been missing, and that difference mattered more than anything else. Kale's voice came again, quieter now, meant for her though it carried clearly in the stillness. "You do not have to face this alone," he said, and the words were not a command, not a promise made lightly. They were a statement of fact, and Elena felt them settle into her with a quiet strength, because she understood now that the connection between them was not symbolic, it was real, something that would remain regardless of how the world reacted to it. Her gaze lifted to meet his, steady and clear. "I am not afraid of what they will say," she replied, and there was no defiance in her tone, no challenge, only truth, because fear had shaped her for too long, and she no longer recognized it the same way. Kale's expression shifted slightly, not into approval, but into acknowledgement, because he understood that this was not about bravery, it was about clarity, and she had found it. The hall around them continued to shift, the murmurs returning but softer now, more contained, as if the room itself was learning how to hold what had just occurred. And Elena realized something else then. something that had not been clear before. This was not just about her being seen. It was about others learning to see differently. And that would take time. It would take resistance. It would take moments like this repeated again and again until what was once impossible became understood. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, not from relief, but from acceptance of what lay ahead. The elder inclined his head once more, a subtle gesture, but one that carried meaning, not submission, but recognition. And Elena noticed it, not because she sought it, but because she understood it now. The language of acknowledgement that existed beneath words, and that understanding settled quietly into her, reinforcing what had already been said into motion. Cale turned slightly then, his attention shifting outward again, not away from her, but forward, toward what came next. "The ceremony is concluded," he said, his voice carrying through the hall with calm finality. And the words marked the end of something that had begun long before Elena ever stepped through those doors, and the beginning of something none of them had yet fully grasped. The fire remained steady behind her, no longer reacting, no longer shifting, but constant, a silent confirmation of what had been established. And as the gathered wolves began to move again, slowly, cautiously, Elena Whitmore remained where she was for a moment longer, not because she did not know what to do, but because she understood that this moment, this exact moment, was something she would carry with her, not as a memory of being chosen, but as the moment she chose not to disappear. And that choice, simple as it seemed, had changed everything, not just for her, but for every wolf who had witnessed it, whether they accepted it yet or not. What changes after this is not what they say. It is what they begin to fear. The thought moved quietly through Elena Whitmore as the hall slowly returned to motion, but nothing about that movement felt the same as before. It was more careful now, more measured, as if every step, every glance, every whisper carried new weight. She remained near the center a moment longer, not because she did not know where to go, but because she understood that stepping away now did not mean returning to what had been. There was no returning, not after this. Her presence in that circle had altered something deeper than a single ceremony. It had exposed a truth that could not be contained within the walls of one hall or the memory of one night. And she could feel it in the way the air shifted even as the crowd began to disperse, in the way conversation stayed low but urgent, in the way some wolves avoided looking at her while others could not look away at all. Cale Draven remained beside her, not moving to lead, not stepping ahead, but staying aligned with her in a way that was deliberate and unmistakable. And that alone changed how others responded, because this was no longer just about her. It was about what she represented standing beside him, and what that meant for everything they thought they understood about power, about rank, about who was meant to stand where. Elena turned slightly, her gaze moving across the hall, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, but observing, taking in the reactions with a clarity she had never allowed herself before. She saw the uncertainty in the elders, the calculation in the nobles, the quiet curiosity in those who had never spoken to her before, and for the first time, she did not interpret those looks as judgment. She saw them as adjustment, because they were no longer deciding whether she belonged. They were trying to understand how she did, and that difference shifted something inside her, not pride, not arrogance, but a steady awareness of her place, not given, not granted, but revealed. Her breath remained calm as she took a small step forward, not away from the center, but out of the rigid boundary of the ritual circle. And that single movement drew attention again, subtle but immediate, because it was the first action she had taken since everything had been acknowledged, and how she moved now mattered. More than words, more than declarations, it defined what came next. She did not rush, did not hesitate. She simply walked, her posture straight, her pace steady, not as someone retreating, but as someone who understood exactly where she stood. And Cale moved with her, not behind, not ahead, but beside his presence, reinforcing what had already been made clear, that this was not temporary, not symbolic, but real. And as they moved, the path before them opened without command, without force, the crowd parting instinctively, not out of fear, but out of recognition. And that silent shift was more powerful than any spoken acknowledgement. Elena felt it as she passed, the way the space responded to her presence now, no longer closing in, no longer pushing her out, but making room, and that simple change carried a weight she could not ignore, because it was something she had never experienced before, something she had never expected to. And yet here it was, undeniable. Kale's voice came quietly at her side, meant only for her, though it carried the same steady clarity it always had. "This will not be simple," he said, and there was no warning in his tone, no attempt to soften what lay ahead, only truth. And Elena understood that. She did not look at him immediately, her gaze still forward as she considered the words, and then she nodded slightly, her voice just as steady. "It was never meant to be," she replied, and that answer held more than acceptance. It held readiness, not for ease, but for reality. And Kale's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not into approval, but into recognition, because that was what this required. Not comfort, not reassurance, but clarity, and she had it. The doors of the hall stood open ahead of them, the night beyond waiting, quiet and vast, and as Elena stepped through them, the cool air met her again, but it did not feel the same as before. It did not feel like something she had been pushed into. It felt like something she was stepping into by choice, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. She paused just beyond the threshold, her gaze lifting slightly toward the dark sky, the stars faint but steady above, and for a moment, everything felt still again, not uncertain, not shifting, but grounded, like the world had realigned around a truth it could no longer ignore. And behind her, the hall remained, no longer a place she had been excluded from, but a place she had changed simply by standing within it. Kale stepped beside her once more, his presence constant, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because words were not needed, the connection between them already established, already understood in a way that went beyond explanation. And as Elena stood there, looking out into what came next, she realized something that settled deep within her, something that removed the last trace of hesitation she had carried. She had not been brought into this moment to be accepted, she had been brought into it to reveal something that had always been missing, and now that it had been revealed, the world would have to adjust, not her, and that truth, quiet but unshakable, became the foundation of everything that would follow. The moment they tried to erase you became the moment they revealed you. The realization settled over Elena Whitmore as she stood beneath the open sky, the cool night air no longer carrying the weight of rejection, but something far more profound, something steady, something irreversible, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to feel it fully, not the shock of what had happened, not the disbelief of how quickly everything had changed, but the quiet certainty beneath it all, the understanding that this had not been sudden, not truly. It had been building, waiting, hidden beneath years of silence and dismissal, until the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. And now that it had surfaced, nothing would push it back down again. Kale Draven stood beside her, his presence as constant as the ground beneath her feet, not overwhelming, not demanding, but unyielding in a way that made everything else feel more defined. And for the first time, Elena did not question why he was there. She did not question what it meant. She simply accepted it as part of what had already been set into motion. Her gaze lifted slightly, tracing the faint line of the horizon where darkness met the promise of something yet to come. And she realized that this night had not just changed how others saw her. It had changed how she saw herself, not as someone waiting to be acknowledged, but as someone who had always held a place that others had failed to recognize. And that shift, internal and unshakable, mattered more than anything that had been spoken within those walls. Behind them, the hall remained alive with quiet movement, the ripple of what had occurred continuing to spread, voices low but urgent, minds adjusting, beliefs shifting in ways that would not settle easily, because what they had witnessed was not something that fit into their understanding. It demanded something more, something new, and that kind of change never came without resistance. Elena knew that, not from experience in this moment, but from the clarity that now guided her thoughts. She understood that what had begun here would not end with acceptance alone. It would be questioned, tested, challenged in ways she could not yet predict, but for the first time, that did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something inevitable, something that would prove what had already been revealed. Kale's voice broke the quiet between them, low and steady, carrying the same calm authority that had reshaped an entire room with a single sentence. "They will speak of this as if it was unexpected," he said, his gaze forward, not toward the hall, not toward the forest, but somewhere beyond both. But it was not. Elena turned her head slightly, her eyes finding his profile, and there was no confusion in her expression now, no uncertainty, only a quiet understanding, because she felt the same truth. Even if she could not yet explain it, her voice came soft, but certain. "They just never thought to look." And the words settled between them like a final piece of something that had been incomplete for far too long. Cale inclined his head slightly, not in agreement alone, but in acknowledgement of what those words meant, not just for her, but for everything that would follow. And for a moment, silence returned, not empty, not uncertain, but full, grounded, complete in a way that required no further explanation. Elena took a slow breath, her shoulders easing as she allowed herself to stand fully within this new reality, not resisting it, not questioning it, but accepting it with a clarity that felt stronger than anything she had ever known before. And as she did, something within her settled into place, not shifting, not searching, but steady, like a flame that had found its balance and would not falter again. She looked forward once more, her gaze steady, her posture calm, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was stepping into something unknown. She felt like she was stepping into something that had been waiting for her all along, something that had always been hers, even when no one else had seen it. And as that realization settled fully within her, she understood something else, something that carried far beyond this night, beyond this ceremony, beyond even the connection that now stood undeniable beside her. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a truth that would not only change her life, but the world that had once refused to see her. And that world, whether it was ready or not, would have to learn, because Elena Whitmore was no longer someone who could be overlooked, no longer someone who could be dismissed. She was the one they had missed, the one they had tried to leave behind, and the one they would never be able to ignore again.